I'm also going to be making some YouTube videos. So this is the first YouTube video. Here's my commentary on some Grandmaster games that are currently happening in Norway Chess. So today is June 5th, Thursday. The time now is 1:20 p.m. And Hikaru Nakamura, so Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura has just drawn Arjun Erigaisi. This was the final position of the game. They repeated moves here, and Hikaru apparently swung the queen back and forth between c2 and f2, and he chose to repeat moves 3 times with Arjun Erigaisi. So when you repeat the same exact position 3 times in chess, when you choose to, or are forced to repeat the same position 3 times in chess, that is going to be a draw between the two players. The game ends, it's a draw. And usually the decision to repeat the position for a third time is something people think about, and they go for it if they feel like their position is not going the way they want it to be going in, and they just want to get out of the game and not risk losing points against another grandmaster. So I wanted to show this position on chess.com and just give some initial impressions. I just saw this position on stream. I mean, at my level, when I'm playing people on chess.com, first of all, in this position, I would definitely prefer taking. I would most likely prefer taking white here rather than black. Is the first thing that comes to my mind. The engine here says it's 0-0-0, which means that according to the engine, there's no advantage here for white or for black. But from a practical standpoint, as black here, I'd be very uncomfortable playing in this position because, even though I have this, so let's look at this position and just go over everything that I'm seeing in this position. So on the black side, what I notice is there's an open B file, right, against white's king. And they've castled opposite sides, or at least they're about to castle opposite sides because black moved the rook on the queen side, so he can no longer castle towards the queen side. The only option if black wants to castle is towards the king side here. And once he castles towards the king side, we're going to have opposite sides castling, right? So white's going to be on the queen side here with the rook and the pawns making like a little fortress around the white king. And the black is going to be on the other side of the board. And so opposite sides castling means the position oftentimes is going to be very sharp, very attacking, because when you castle on opposite sides, so usually when you castle, you're not supposed to move the pawns in front of the king, right? Let's say black castles here, right, and white just makes a move. You're not really supposed to, in chess, like move the pawns in front of your king. Like this is generally, if I wanted to play badly, those would be the moves that I would play. And it's because these pawns here are your bodyguards. They're supposed to be protecting your king, right? They're supposed to be protecting your king because if you don't have the pawns around your king, like things can go south really, really quickly. Imagine you just play a few moves here, white swings the queen over, and now all of a sudden you have no protection over here. You make one more, black wastes one more move, and it's already made in one with the queen and the rook, right? I'm just giving an example here. Obviously, these are not moves I would actually play, but I'm trying to show the concept of why when you castle, first of all, you're not supposed to be moving the pawns in front of your king. They're supposed to stay back and actually protect your king from danger. But if the thing is, if it's opposite sides castling, right? If it's opposite sides castling, then white actually gets to move all of these pawns down the board, whereas he usually wouldn't be able to. Imagine if the white king was over here, right? If the white king castled king side and these pawns were hanging out back here on the second rank, usually I'm saying you wouldn't want to push these pawns down the board because, well, these pawns have to be protecting your king. But in an opposite side castling situation, that's not the same. So these pawns have the freedom to march down the board, and they have the freedom to go in and just try to go. They have the freedom to try to just like march down the position and try to checkmate or break into the black fortress over there on the queen side. So that's like the first feature of this position is that it's opposite sides castling. So that means, pawns are going to be marching down the board. They're going to be trading into the enemy castle, and we're going to have like some attacks happen, right? So now let's talk about concretely what else is going on in this position. In addition to opposite sides castling, there's an open B file here, right? And an open B file or a semi-open B file means that, open file means that there's no pawns on the board on that file, right? So on this D file here, you see that there's no pawns anywhere on the D file. And so in chess, that's known as an open file. And open files means the rook has the ability to transport itself up and down the open file. And unlike, imagine if the rook over here, imagine if we're looking at the rook over here, the pawn's getting in the way of the rook. And so the rook doesn't have the ability to go up and down the H file, right? You can see here it's blocked by the pawn. But in this position with the open D file, right, this rook is able to go up and down the file. And for example, one thing that might happen, which is, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but let's say you go here, right? Now all of a sudden, the queen, for example, can team up with the rook and, for example, give a check here and force the king to go back and do all kinds of nasty things along the D file. So the D file is open, right? The F file is semi-open because there's a single pawn here, but there's no corresponding pawn on the F file. On the other side, the B file is semi-open. So we have a pawn here on the white side, but no corresponding pawn on the black side. So what I see on the black side is in the long term, the queen could potentially team up with the rook. And when the queen teams up the queen teaming up the rook here is going to be dangerous for white. Is it dangerous or is it not dangerous? Depends on whether white can defend the position, right? Right now, we're defending horizontally with the queen. But even though it's defended, right? Even though it's defended, that doesn't mean this move here is useless because the fact that we're counting on the queen to defend the B2 pawn means the queen can never actually move away. If the queen moves away, rook takes B2, right? And we're going to have issues down the B file. So that's the first thing I see is the open B file. And on the other side, we have the semi-open F file with the rook and the queen working together to put pressure on this pawn here on F7. Another thing I see here with black is this bad bishop here on D6. The bishop's locked in by his own pawn. In the long term, what black perhaps wants to do is put the bishop over here and put pressure on this. Put pressure on the C3 and B2 pawn. Like, let's say black goes here, white makes a move. And now, so let's say white makes a move here. Right, you go here. White makes another move, then all of a sudden, after takes, check here. For example, we have this check. And there's going to be some issues, again, surrounding these B2 and C3, surrounding the B2 and C3 pawn chain in combination with the open B file is another thing I'm seeing in this position. But for now, the bishop's not really doing anything useful, at least not at this current moment. And this bishop, on the other hand, is also, it's blocked in by the E pawn. The bishop would really like to be on this square right now. If you could imagine, right? If you could imagine being able to put the bishop anywhere on the board, I would put it right here, right? This would be the dream square for the bishop to be on because in this position, the bishop would be slicing through the entire board and controlling all of these important squares around the queen. But as of right now, it's stuck defending this pawn, and it's looking at these squares, which aren't, right now, they're not very useful. maybe the bishop can go here, but if the bishop goes here, okay, you might push the pawn. Which, if the bishop does go there, if the bishop chooses to go over here and white pushes the pawn, um, this would be also kind of dangerous for white because, again, you're not really supposed to push the pawns in front of your king, right? These pawns, again, have to be hanging out on the second rank, protecting the king. That's the whole point of castling. And so, actually, so I started out this video by saying that these bishops weren't good at their first glance, but actually, as the more I analyze it, the more good the bishops actually become. They're less bad than what my first impression was, just like looking at the position outright, because bishop here and bishop here were actually applying some kind of pressure on the white king here. It's better than nothing. The first thing I saw was that this bishop was blocked by the pawn over here, and that bishop, the white square bishop, is blocked by the e6 pawn. But actually, if you give black a few moves, he might be able to give some kind of pressure, apply some kind of pressure onto the white position. Okay, so we covered the b file. We covered opposite sides castling. We covered the semi-open f file. We covered the two bishops here. What else did we cover? The white bishop here, the light square bishop here, I think is in a decent spot. You might, or I might as white choose to reroute the bishop and move it back onto this diagonal, because once black castles, let's say white goes there, right? Let's say black wastes a move. I go here. Let's say black wastes another move. I go here, right? Let's say he wastes another move. I mean, obviously, in a real game, he's not going to just like waste moves, waste all of these moves in a row. But I'm just showing, right? If sometimes if people don't pay attention and they don't see what you're trying to accomplish, oftentimes, like, you can just execute on a plan and go for it. So we put the queen here, and then, like, for example, right, we would be able to give a checkmate there is one potential idea we could go for. And, it would be up for black to try to stop you and, play a move like g6, or try to prevent your bishop reroute, or try to make your queen do something other than give the checkmate here on h7. All right. So this bishop, I think, is in a decent spot. It's in a decent spot also because there's no pawns coming in to kick the bishop out, right? So you can imagine if there was a pawn over here, right? If the pawn were over here on the d file, then we would always be worried about the pawn pushing forward, pushing the bishop out. But because there's no pawns coming down the b file and no pawns coming down the d file, the bishop here, it's not in danger of being kicked out by a pawn. In fact, if I push forward here, right, it would be pretty secure, except, it just pushing this pawn here, again, we don't really want to do that. So maybe a better way to do that, maybe a better way to proceed could even be putting this pawn here and tucking the bishop in the back, right? So a better way to execute on this plan would be tucking the bishop back, right? And then maybe queen here. Maybe black wants to threaten to take b2. Maybe I go back this way, right? Maybe black puts his bishop here, and then I have the same idea here, potentially giving a checkmate down on h7 there. All right, so that's this bishop. What else? So let's go back. The rook here on the d file is, I think it's decent, right? We have the ability to team up with the queen at any time to try to make an attack happen on the d file, although that attack seems like relatively not as strong. And then covering the semi-open f file, for example, one idea you could go for, let's say black wastes a move, right? You could just go knight here, queen takes, and then You could give this classic check down the f file. Rook works together with the queen and gives a check here on f7. And then luckily it's black's turn to move, right? So it's if it were white's turn to move here, if black wastes a move and it were white's turn to move. So let's go back to the original position. This was the original position. If black wastes a turn and white makes a move like that, or in this position, it's somehow not as good. Let's say you go here. Let's say takes here. So in this position, like you would even have takes and again, trying to use this open D file to make something happen. I'm not saying, again, like when I look at this position, I'm not saying exactly that's how things are going to go down, right? I'm not saying that, black is just going to play stupid moves all the time and just let white do whatever he wants to do, or that white is going to let black do everything that he wants to do. But I'm showing the potential ideas in the position, right? If black, for example, makes 2 bad moves in a row, 3 bad moves in a row, concretely as white, like, what do you do to like punish the position? What are the threats that you can make to actually punish black? And conversely, what are the threats black can make to actually punish white? So I'm looking at the semi-open F file for sure here. And I think the last feature of this position I would also look at, well, 2 more features actually. So there is an isolated E pawn here, right? So we have a pawn here and pawns, remember, like to be side by side. They like to be next to each other like this, standing next to each other so they can protect each other, right? Look at this pawn and that pawn. The B pawn protects the C pawn. And if I push the A pawn forward, right, the pawns being next to each other, they're able to stand side by side and kind of like hold hands and stand together. But this pawn is standing all by himself. He doesn't have any neighbors coming in to protect him anytime soon. So I'm always a little bit worried here about this isolated E pawn. Maybe black at some point moves the queen in here and threatens to take it, although he's not going to do that on this move, right? And also, not only is the E pawn isolated, but this diagonal right here could potentially also be the target of some kind of dark squared attack, because you'll notice that the king here is on a dark square, and this dark square diagonal, if, for example, a bishop were to appear on g5, right? Not saying it's going to happen right now, but that could potentially be an issue also. And so that's the isolated E pawn. So what did we cover? We covered the opposite side castling. We covered the black bishops. We covered the open B file. We covered the white bishop here. We covered the open D file, the open F file, open D file, open F file. We have the isolated E pawn. And then what else? We have this open diagonal here. We have this open dark square diagonal here. And the last thing I want to cover maybe in this position is the advancing G and H pawns, right? So the advancing G and H pawns, you'll notice, so black's A pawn is still on the original square, but white's G and H pawns are already marching down the board. So if black, for example, were to castle here, right? We want to castle. We want to put our king to safety. Then white's attack is already kind of rolling down the board with g5, right? Let's say here, right? Let's say black does nothing, takes, right? Takes, and then all of a sudden, look at what's happening over here. We have checks coming down, right? Queen here, king h8. Let's say we move the queen here, teaming up the rook. Now all of a sudden, right? You can't even go here because that's a checkmate, right? And if you do nothing, right, that's also a checkmate over here. And so black has to perhaps make a move like bishop here, right? Defending the checkmate. But that's an example of like how checkmates can quickly happen from like a pawn storm, from just launching the pawns down the board and opening up the G and H files to the opponent's king. So after black castles here, right? After black castles here, I would be pretty happy about the prospect of pushing this G pawn down the board. Or I don't know if I'm happy about it or if I'm not happy about it. It's just something that occurs to me as something that could potentially be a decisive factor in the position. Now, so with all of this in mind, I really did think that Hikaru Nakamura, who had the white position here, right? So Grandmaster Hikaru, he had the white position here, and black was Arjun Erigaisi. I thought white here had decent attacking chances, right, from the G and H pawn. And so, if you made me pick a side here, if you asked me in this position, black to move, would I rather be black here or would I rather be white here? Probably I would pick white. That was so. When I look at a position like this, like, yeah, even though the computer says it's basically even, I probably would pick white. And I think Hikaru Nakamura, maybe he saw some of the counterplay that black had and decided not to go into it. But I definitely would try to roll down the board here. So let's say black castles, and now let's actually evaluate like according to the engine. And I'll play a few moves, and I'm just curious. Like, I'm curious if the white attack actually works out here. So black castles, and what if I just roll down the board? If I roll down the board here, well, if black's smart, he's not going to take, right? Because if he takes, I take, he won't be very happy about this open H file I have with the rook and the queen coming in. So I'm not going to assume here that black's going to make a totally stupid move. Let's say he just pushes forward, or if I were black here, what I do? I would probably push forward, right? I push forward, and then in this position, I might push forward one more time, sacrificing that pawn. Well, maybe not, right? I would consider sacrificing the pawn because after this, you open or you increase the strength. Black increases the power of my bishop, although I wouldn't do that there because my queen and my rook are on the F file, and his rook is on the F file, and I don't want his rook staring at my queen, so probably I might not push forward necessarily. I might try to make a weakness here by perhaps, I might go queen here, try to tickle the pawn, try to tickle the H pawn, and ask Arjun Erigaisi, okay, well, how do you defend the pawn over here? And maybe Arjun Erigaisi says, okay, I'll play G6 defending the pawn, and then the question will be how to continue from there. And so here I would probably go knight back, try to reroute it, and land my knight onto the f6 square. So here, right, let's say he tries to attack. Maybe I'll put my rook on f4, and let's say he goes here, tickling my rook, right? I might swing my rook around this way. Which would not be good in that position because black would be able to take b2 because I'm cutting off my second-rank defense between the queen and the pawn. So maybe white's attack, after a little bit of analysis, maybe white's attack isn't as strong as I expected from first glance. I was really counting on these two pawns being something. I was really counting on these two pawns being more useful than they appeared. But, after h5, after castles, push, I think the continuation isn't. I think the continuation for white isn't as convincing as what I thought it looked like at first glance. And the continuation for black here actually looks maybe a little better even. So yeah, overall, my initial impression was definitely to take white because of these two pawns here, because I thought the bishops were not as strong as they might have. I thought these bishops were not as strong as they might turn out to be later in the game. So I thought these two pawns were super strong, and would have been a big problem if black castled. I thought the bishops were bad because the white square bishop is blocked by the pawn, and so is the dark square bishop. And I thought the semi-open f file was also useful for making something happen. But if I look a few moves, if I look a few moves further, it seems like these G and H pawns aren't actually that useful. The bishops are better than I thought at first, and then the semi-open F file isn't perhaps as useful as it would have appeared at first glance. And this B file is probably a little better than I would have expected also. So maybe Hikaru Nakamura choosing to draw here. Okay, I think at first I was confused, but after just running through this and doing a quick analysis, yeah, it makes a lot more sense, like why he chose to draw in that position. White's attack is not convincing enough, and he has a lot of issues coming down the pipeline in his position to be worried about. And black, although his position doesn't look impressive at first glance, it has a lot of potential and can really come to life in just a few moves. Anyway, that's my take on this position. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Come watch the Twitch stream later for more chess speed running. And see you guys next time in the next YouTube video.